Every now and again, the Gospels will tell us that Jesus went off by himself to a deserted place to pray, or Jesus went up to the mountain to pray. And on a couple of occasions, I've had some people ask me, having reflected upon that, Father, wouldn't it have been a wonderful experience to go with Jesus and experience those moments of prayer with him? They obviously overlook an event that occurs in 3 out of the 4 Gospels, in which Peter, James, and John do just that. And the interesting thing about accompanying Jesus in these moments of prayer is that it is anything but peaceful. They go up and they experience the awesome presence of God, the presence of the Father speaking from the heavens, Jesus being transfigured before them. And they are very much afraid. They're not at peace. Last week, for the first Sunday of Lent, and every year for the first Sunday of Lent, we always hear the gospel of the temptations of Jesus. Appropriately so, because our activities and exercises during Lent invite just that, temptation. We give up something, hopefully something difficult, and over time, it begins to wear on us, and we become tempted to take it back early or find reasons why we either don't do it at all, do it a different way, or simply take back what we've given up, assuming we've given something up at all. And when we experience that temptation, instead of giving in, we turn to God in prayer. And the following Sunday of Lent, the second Sunday of Lent, every year is one of the gospel stories of the Transfiguration of Jesus, which is not just about the glorification of Jesus before these apostles, but it is a gospel about prayer. These men go up and accompany Jesus as he goes up the mountain to pray, and we see the experience it was for them. A great cloud envelops them in darkness. They are very much afraid. And the voice cries out from heaven, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." I think it very much coincides with what we read from at least 2 of the great Spanish mystics, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, both of whom Carmelites, both of whom are doctors of the church, both of whom wrote great classics regarding spirituality and especially prayer. And in particular, the experience of contemplative prayer, the intense experience of prayer when we enter into the awesome presence of God. And they both have something very, very much in common as they describe this, and that it is anything but peaceful. For Teresa of Avila, she says, the further we get to that most interior of castles, the more we are shedding aspects of this world that we are accompanied to, that we are comfortable with, until we shed everything, including the senses, including even personal worldly comfort. And ultimately, that intense contemplative experience of God must inevitably include suffering, intense discomfort, because God is so beyond our senses as to be beyond everything worldly to us, including what we would consider worldly comfort. And when we experience that contemplative state of prayer, we really have no memory of that experience. All we know is the effect of it when it is over, and it is overwhelming. And that very famous statue of the Ecstasy of St. Teresa of Avila by Bernini is not one as modern interpreters of art would consider her experiencing a physical climax of sorts, but her swooning because that contemplative state is so overwhelming. Also, with her, St. John of the Cross has coined the phrase, the dark night of the soul, which I know I was raised to believe was a state of despair and desolation in which we feel an absence of God. And yet we have to cling to the presence of God even in the midst of that desolation. And yet, having actually read the dark night of the soul, what John is describing is what Teresa is describing: the state of the contemplative experience of God himself. And he refers to that direct experience of God as the dark night, in which God is so beyond our senses that we are in fact enveloped in darkness. He's beyond our sight. He's beyond our sound. He's beyond all the senses, in which we are nothing left but utter darkness as we experience the intense, overwhelming presence of God. That is how both of them describe the intense experience of contemplative prayer and being in God's presence. And that is what the apostles experience in today's gospel. So what must it have been like to join Jesus on those moments when he goes up the mountaintop to pray? This, perhaps, is what it is like. An intense experience of Jesus and the one he is praying to, and the unity of the entire Godhead coming together. Jesus transfigured before them, the fulfillment of the law symbolized in the presence of Moses, and the prophets symbolized in the presence of Elijah, and the voice of the Father proclaiming from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." They are enveloped in darkness and are very much afraid. Be careful what we wish for when we seek that presence of God. It can in many ways be for us a very presumptive desire, and yet nonetheless a blessing. We can perhaps kid ourselves or be, again, very presumptuous if we think that experience of the awesome presence of God would be something peaceful. It is a good experience, and it would be. But God is awesome, awful, great, a God that we fear in great awe, not in great terror, a God's presence that is overwhelming. What are our goals of prayer as we continue during this season of Lent? This year, during Lent, we are participating in a year of St. Joseph. And we see St. Joseph as a model of faith in many, many ways. Interestingly enough, in what we hear and read of him in the Scriptures, at no time do we ever really experience a story of Joseph praying. The same perhaps could be said of the Blessed Virgin Mary, but at least it goes on to say that Mary pondered what she experienced in her heart. She reflected upon them in her heart. And in that reflection was very much in tune with God's will. But we really don't hear that about Joseph. But perhaps it's already a very strong presumption as we go into the stories of the gospel and as we hear about Joseph. While we don't necessarily hear of him going off and praying, we do hear of him being very much in tune with the will of God. Even perhaps in times when he is tempted to step away from it, such as the time when he learns that Mary is with child before they were married, and he decides to divorce her quietly. But then immediately we hear how in tune Joseph becomes in his vision of the angel while he is asleep. Now, of course, many would say that, yes, we do hear of Joseph praying. He gets his visions when he's asleep, and rather humorously, I and a number of people make reference to the Joseph prayer as when we go and take a nap and go to sleep. Joseph got his visions when he was asleep, so we call sleeping the Joseph prayer. But all kidding aside, on more than one occasion, Joseph receives that direct communication from the angel that makes him in tune and very much in touch with the will of God. It was not always comfortable for him. He was a good and upright man with a very good reputation in his town. But the angel of the Lord said to him, "Have no fear in taking Mary as your wife." Well, why would he be afraid? Taking on a woman who is his wife with a child that was not his, and yet claiming her and claiming the child, what must that have done to his reputation and his standing as a good and upright man? After all, later on in Nazareth, when Jesus preaches, how do the people react? Isn't that carpenter's son? When Joseph received the vision from the angel again to tell him to take the child and his mother and flee into Egypt, again, a very fearful experience and a very unknown future. And yet without hesitation, from that experience of God, he fulfilled God's will in taking Jesus and Mary out of harm's way and fulfilling a bit of the prophecy of the Old Testament that out of Egypt God has called his son. We don't hear much of stories that say Joseph went off and prayed, but we certainly have those stories that clearly imply that he was very much in touch with the will of God, and we cannot do that without being people of prayer. So let us see Joseph as our model in prayer, and how we, through our prayer, seek that intense experience of the presence of God, and most importantly, through prayer, become more and more in tune with God's will, which more often than not is never our will, and rarely is something of complete comfort and complete peacefulness for any of us. We flatter ourselves today often, let's face it. What would God say? Well, shush. What do you know? He'd say exactly what I'd say. What would Jesus do? Well, what do you know? He'd do exactly what I'd do. Reducing prayer to nothing more than wishful thinking, and God as nothing more than an imaginary friend. But in prayer, as we experience in the true state of contemplation, which both Teresa and John of the Cross say is a gift from God, nothing that we can really attain on our own, but which we can foster that disposition in and through our prayer. Let us use this season of Lent and the wider year of St. Joseph to commit to grow in that basic call we have in communicating with God in that state of prayer. Always looking to have that great gift of the experience of the awesome presence of God. And just as importantly, that prayer will move us during the season, throughout the year, and all our lives to being in tune with the will of God so that we can carry it out. We have this year that experience in St. Joseph, a truly holy man, truly a man of prayer, transfigured by his closeness himself to God and God's will, and who we know can, even at this occasion, as with the baptism of Jesus, can, because of that holiness, stand with God the Father and say of Jesus, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him."